It's amazing, isn't it? We're constantly bombarded with news about the latest technological marvels, scientific breakthroughs, but we often forget about the quieter, but perhaps even more profound, power of ideas.
Absolutely. The concepts that take root in our minds, maybe through the books we read, the conversations we have, these can end up shaping how we see the world, sometimes for the better, and sometimes, well, not so much.
Yeah, and we've all heard about the great books that have kind of formed the bedrock of Western thought. But today we're going to be looking at something a bit different. What if you could say there are evil opposites to those great books?
Now, that's a really intriguing and maybe even a little unsettling thought.
Hmm.
The idea that there are certain texts, maybe ones we really respect, or that have just been super influential, that could have actually led us down some pretty dangerous paths, paths with consequences we never saw coming.
And that is exactly where we are going in this deep dive. We'll be using Benjamin Wicker's book, 10 Books That Screwed Up the World and 5 Others That Didn't Help, as our guide.
Okay, so right off the bat, you might be thinking, wow, that's a pretty bold title. And honestly, Wicker's not exactly known for holding back.
Definitely not. But our goal here isn't to just accept everything he says at face value. What we really want to do is unpack his arguments, understand why he singles out these particular books as being so impactful and, in his view, so detrimental.
Right, so think of it like this. You're getting a crash course in Wicker's perspective. We're extracting that core DNA of his argument, examining the claims he makes, the evidence he uses, all without you having to wade through hundreds of pages of text.
Exactly. We're talking about some pretty foundational books here. Works like Machiavelli's The Prince, Descartes' Discourse on Method, Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. No one can deny that these books had a huge impact on how our political system, our philosophical ideas, even our social structures developed.
Yeah, and Wicker's contention is basically that this impact has been, for the most part, negative.
Exactly. And before we dive in, it's important to remember that Benjamin Wicker isn't just some guy with an opinion. The man's got serious academic credentials. He's got a PhD from Vanderbilt, he's taught at a bunch of universities, and his work as a senior fellow at various theological centers really informs his viewpoint. He's coming at this from within a very specific intellectual and moral tradition.
It's important to keep that context in mind. And it's not just Wicker either. Thinkers like Thomas E. Woods, Jr., he's endorsed this book. He really emphasizes the importance of figuring out where things might have gone wrong, where Western civilization sort of jumped the tracks.
And Elizabeth Cantor, too. She
Yeah.
talks about how this book explores some really fundamental questions about, well, everything, really. Human nature, morality, sex, economics, law, the whole shebang. So Wicker is definitely tapping into a bigger, broader conversation that's been going on for a while about the direction Western culture is heading.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we're going to zero in on a few of these books that Wicker sees as those evil opposites I mentioned earlier.
Mm.
We're going to pull out those core criticisms so you get a really clear sense of his perspective.
Okay, so let's get down to business. Let's start with a name that has basically become a synonym for political ruthlessness. Niccolo Machiavelli and his still super controversial book, The Prince. When you hear the word Machiavellian, what pops into your head?
I mean, you instantly think of someone who's sneaky, manipulative, willing to do absolutely anything to stay in power, right? Someone who puts their own interests above everyone else's. Not exactly the kind of person you'd want running things in a society that values honesty and ethics.
Right, exactly. And Wicker points out that even back in Machiavelli's time, people were already kind of wary of him. I mean, even Shakespeare got in on the act, calling him the murderous Machiavellian Richard III. Fast forward almost 500 years, and that association with calculated cruelty has really stuck. But Wicker doesn't want us to just settle for the caricature. So what was Machiavelli really saying in The Prince?
Well, he was arguing basically that a ruler who wants to maintain order, keep things stable, has to be willing to, be able not to be good, as he put it. He genuinely thought that clinging to those traditional moral values could actually be harmful. Like it could actually make it harder for a ruler to do their job and prevent things from descending into chaos.
So sometimes he was saying doing bad stuff is necessary for a greater good.
Exactly. And for Machiavelli, that greater good was often staying in power, maintaining stability. Wicker even pulls out this really vivid example from history to illustrate this point. Caesar Borgia and what he did in the Romagna region.
Ah, yes, that's a pretty chilling story. Can you remind us what happened there?
Okay, so Borgia, he wanted to bring order to the Romagna, which was notorious for being super lawless and unstable. But he also knew that if he personally resorted to brute force, it would make him massively unpopular.
Yeah.
So what did he do? He brought in this guy, Ramiro de Orco, who basically had a reputation for being utterly ruthless. Ramiro did his thing, and yeah, he restored order, but then, in a totally calculated move, Borgia had him publicly executed, like put his body on display in the marketplace.
I mean, it's brutal, but you can see the logic there.
Totally. It's a power move. The people were terrified of Ramiro, so it appeased them, and Borgia got to distance himself from the dirty work. And Wiker points out that Machiavelli doesn't criticize Borgia for this, not at all. He actually praises him for it, calls him a model for any ruler who wants to seize power.
So Machiavelli's saying it's better to be feared than loved, basically.
In a nutshell, yeah. And for Wiker, this kind of thinking only makes sense if you've basically chucked out the traditional ideas about religion and morality. He suggests that Machiavelli was operating in a world where there was no really fear of divine punishment, no belief in an immortal soul. It's like if earthly power is all there is, then right and wrong just become about what works, what helps you keep that power.
It's a pretty bleak outlook.
It is, and Wiker brings up a modern example that kind of makes this even more unsettling. There were those reports out of Ukraine about fetal tissue being used for beauty treatments.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And Wiker uses this to show what can happen when you base your moral compass solely on results. It's like if all that matters is looking younger, then suddenly you can justify exploiting fetal remains. It shows how easily the definition of good can get twisted when you remove any kind of transcendent moral framework.
It makes you wonder what's next, right? Where do you draw the line once that happens?
Exactly. And Wiker makes it clear that Machiavelli is consciously saying, hey, I'm not dealing with fantasy worlds, okay? He's all about looking at the world as it is, how people actually behave, not how they should behave.
It's a pretty pragmatic and maybe even cynical approach.
Definitely. Machiavelli basically says, look, if you're always trying to be a good guy, you're going to get crushed by the people who aren't playing by those rules. So a ruler has to be willing to get their hands dirty, to do what needs to be done to protect their state and their power. Effectiveness over morality, basically.
All right, well, let's shift gears a bit. Let's move from the world of cutthroat politics to the foundations of modern philosophy. We're going to talk about René Descartes and his very influential work, Discourse on Method. And Wiker uses a pretty striking image to kick off his analysis of Descartes. Do you remember what it was?
Oh, yeah. He compares Descartes' method of doubt to, get this, curing a headache by chopping off the head.
That's a pretty vivid analogy.
It is. And the point he's making is, Descartes was trying to fight skepticism, right? He wanted to find a way to be absolutely certain about things. But his method, well, it was so radical that it ended up having some seriously negative consequences for how we think in the West. Kind of like using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut, you know.
Overkill, for sure. Can you break down Descartes' big philosophical project for us? And why does Wiker think it's so problematic?
Okay, so Descartes wanted to find an unshakable foundation for knowledge. He was living in a world where there was a ton of intellectual disagreement, especially in philosophy. And he thought that all this disagreement meant that there was no real wisdom out there. So his solution was to doubt everything. I mean, everything. What your senses tell you, tradition, even math, all because people disagreed about these things.
So just because people have different opinions, it means there's no truth to be found.
That was his idea, yeah. And Wiker tells this funny story about how he saw some white paint spilled on his driveway and heard his neighbor saying she was painting her kitchen white. He started thinking, oh man, she's doing this to get back at me, and got all worked up. Turns out it wasn't paint, it was plaster from his own house renovation. Right? He uses this to show how ridiculous it can be to doubt everything you see and experience. Like sometimes things are just what they seem, you know?
Common sense isn't always wrong.
Exactly. But Descartes' method was all about doubting everything except his own thinking self. And for Wiker, this led to something pretty bad. The idea that your subjective experience is the ultimate test of truth.
So, like, truth is whatever you think it is.
Yeah, basically. Wiker calls this methodical egoism because Descartes' whole philosophy is built on the foundation of his own I. But there's more. The way Descartes defined this I was also super influential, and Wiker thinks it's been super harmful. Descartes was all, hey, I can imagine myself existing without a body or a physical world, so that means I'm essentially just a thinking thing. He completely separated the mind from the body.
And this separation has been, a big topic in Western philosophy ever since.
Huge. But for Wiker, it's been a negative thing. It leads to this idea that human life is just a bunch of mechanisms, that the body and the natural world are like machines, It paves the way for materialism, where the soul becomes irrelevant.
So what are the big evils that Wiker blames on Descartes?
He lists four. First, it makes people think that their personal thoughts about God are just as good as actual wisdom about God. Like it encourages a kind of intellectual selfishness. Second, it leads to the idea that reality is whatever we think it is, which can get pretty messy, right? Third, it reduces human life to a machine, which is pretty dehumanizing. And fourth, it turns God into just a projection of our egos, which means there are no real moral limits anymore.
Okay, so let's move on to another big name, Thomas Hobbes and his famous work, Leviathan. Now, Hobbes had a pretty grim view of human nature, didn't he?
He did. He basically thought that in a state of nature, before society's formed, there's no morality at all. No good, no evil, no right, no wrong, none of it. Humans, according to him, are just driven by pleasure and avoiding pain, ruled by their desires, and they have absolutely no conscience about how they satisfy those desires.
Wow, so we're starting from a pretty bleak place with Hobbes.
We are. And he doesn't stop there either. He comes up with this really controversial idea about human rights.
Okay, so let's hear it.
He pretty much says that human rights are the same as human desires. Like, whatever you want, you have a right to it. Doesn't matter if it's moral or not. And Wiker points out that Hobbes is a key figure in how this idea developed, the idea that we have a right to everything we desire, and that the government's job is to protect those rights no matter what.
Interesting. So what does Wiker have to say about that? I mean, it's a pretty powerful idea, right?
He's not buying it. He calls it a groundless claim.
Yeah.
He says that we talk about rights all the time these days, but it often kind of obscures deeper moral questions. Like, for Wiker, Hobbes doesn't actually give a good reason for why we should have a right to everything. He just says we do.
That's a good point. We often just assume that rights are this self-evident thing.
Right. And Wiker also sees a problem with how we use the word right today. It's like saying, I have a right to do X has become a way of saying, I really want to do X, even if that desire is, morally iffy.
It's almost like rights have become this shield for our desires, no matter how selfish they are.
Exactly. And Wiker points out a really common protest slogan that illustrates this perfectly. No one has a right to tell me what to do.
You hear that one a lot.
Yeah, and Wiker says the emphasis there is on right, in the Hobbesian sense, as this assertion of pure desire, not right as in morally correct. It's like, in this framework, saying, I believe abortion is wrong is no different than saying, I don't like broccoli. It's all just personal preference.
So in a nutshell, Wiker is pretty critical of Hobbes's ideas about human nature and rights.
He is. He thinks that if a society takes Hobbes too seriously, it can actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, even though Hobbes's state of nature was just a thought experiment, if everyone starts acting like they had a right to whatever they want, it can lead to a real breakdown of society. It's all just individuals demanding things, with no regard for the consequences.
Well, let's move from Hobbes's rather pessimistic take on humanity to someone who had a much more optimistic view, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Wiker contrasts them pretty starkly, right?
He does, yeah. Rousseau thought that humans are basically good. It's civilization that corrupts us. He believed that science and the arts, they don't make us morally better. In fact, they might actually make us more clever and devious in how we're bad. He called us happy slaves, with this fake veneer of virtue, but no real goodness underneath.
So for him, it's all downhill from the state of nature, huh? Did he have a different concept of natural man than Hobbes?
Oh, totally. Wiker jokingly compares Hobbes' natural man to a gorilla, nasty, brutish, and short. But Rousseau's version is more like a peaceful bonobo, totally innocent, carefree, and, well, Wiker uses the term cheerfully libidinous, which pretty much sums it up.
Okay, so free love in the Garden of Eden, basically.
Pretty much. But Rousseau takes it even further. He says these natural men, they were totally solitary, didn't have houses, property, language, not even families. They just lived in the moment, driven by their senses, not reason.
And he sees the development of family and society as the beginning of the end.
Exactly. He talks about this first revolution that messed everything up.
What was that?
It seems pretty simple, right? Someone builds a hut, a woman comes to live with him, boom. Family, private property, the idea of mine versus yours. For Rousseau, this was a huge step away from our natural freedom. And from there, he says, things just went downhill fast.
And so the fall from grace begins with a hut and a woman.
You got it. And Wiker explains that this is where things like adultery, gluttony, crime, all of that stuff comes from. Before, it was all just free love, everyone sharing everything. But once you have families and possessions, suddenly you have things to steal, people to cheat on, and so on. It's like that famous quote from Rousseau. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society.
That's a powerful image.
It is. And Wiker shows how this idea directly influenced later thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They basically took Rousseau's idea about private property being the root of all evil and ran with it.
Right, because Marx and Engels, they were all about abolishing private property.
Exactly. And they also adopted Rousseau's free love ideas. They thought the traditional family was just another form of oppression. They were convinced that the only way to get rid of all these social problems was to get rid of private property altogether. That's the heart of communism, right?
It is, and it's interesting, too, how Rousseau's thinking, even if we don't realize it, has shaped modern views on a lot of stuff. Sexuality, marriage, even social isolation. Like, if you believe that we're naturally meant to be solitary and sexually free, then traditional marriage is going to seem like a prison.
Right. It's like hell is other people, like Sartre said.
Exactly. And the funny thing about Rousseau, or maybe not so funny, is that his own life kind of contradicts this whole sentimental philosophy of natural goodness.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he wrote all this stuff about how wonderful and pure human nature is, but then he went and abandoned all 5 of his own kids to orphanages.
Oh.
Talk about a disconnect between your ideals and your actions.
Okay, so let's move on to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. We can't talk about influential and potentially harmful books without mentioning their big one, the Communist Manifesto. And Wiker starts off by asking a really interesting question. Should we blame philosophers for how their ideas are interpreted and used later on?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? He brings up Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, points out that even these guys had students who supported tyrannical regimes. So it's not a new debate at all. It's like, where does the philosopher's responsibility end and the followers begin?
Right, it's not a simple answer. And Wiker also dives into Marx's personality a bit, using descriptions from people who knew him. What kind of picture does he paint?
Well, apparently Marx was known for being pretty dogmatic, super intolerant of anyone who disagreed with him. People describe him as incredibly scornful, sarcastic, just generally unpleasant to be around.
So not exactly a warm and fuzzy guy?
Not really, no.
Right.
Which might explain why there were only a handful of people at his funeral, as Wiker points out.
Okay, well, let's get to the heart of the Communist Manifesto. What was the fundamental principle of communism as Marx and Engels saw it?
Simple. Abolish private property.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's it. That's the core. They wanted a total break from the way things were, not just in terms of who owns what, but also in terms of our ideas about justice, love, marriage, everything.
Yeah.
They promised this future communist utopia where everyone would be totally free.
Free to do what, exactly?
Free to develop as individuals without being held back by class structures, oppression, all of that. The idea was that once private property was gone, everyone would benefit and society would flourish.
Right, but it's never quite that simple, is it?
Nope. And one of the things Wiker criticizes is Marx's theory of historical materialism. This idea that the way a society produces its basic necessities like food and shelter determines its entire social structure, and that leads to class conflict.
So it's all about economics, basically.
Pretty much. And he extends this to the family, too. He thinks the traditional family is just a product of capitalism and that it needs to be abolished along with private property. He saw history as this constant struggle between classes, always driven by material factors.
Okay, and Wiker has a problem with this emphasis on materialism.
Big time. He says Marx made this huge mistake by reducing human beings to just their material needs. Like, yeah, we need food, shelter, clothes, but we're not just machines churning out products. We have a spiritual side. We want truth, beauty, happiness, things that go beyond just the physical.
Right, we're not just economic units.
Exactly. And Wiker thinks that Marx's obsession with material things blinded him to this whole other dimension of human existence.
He even applied this class conflict framework to the family, didn't he? Like, the family was just another battleground.
Totally. He saw the bourgeois family as a tool of the capitalist class and thought it had to go. And there's that famous accusation against communists that they want a community of women, right?
Yeah, I've heard that one.
Well, Marx's response was basically, hey, bourgeois society already has a community of women. It's just hidden under a layer of hypocrisy. His point was that the way marriage and property worked back then, it was like women were already being treated as commodities.
Interesting point.
But then he doesn't really offer a solution. He just raises the question like, okay, so how is society supposed to function without the family?
Which is a pretty big question to leave unanswered, especially when you're calling for a total revolution.
Right. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about John Stuart Mill and his influential work, Utilitarianism. Now, Wiker makes it clear that Mill didn't actually invent utilitarianism.
No, that was Jeremy Bentham, a friend of Mill's father. Bentham was an atheist, and he thought you didn't need religion to figure out morality. It was all about calculating pleasure and pain. The greatest happiness for the greatest number. That was his big idea.
Exactly. And even though Mill was influenced by Bentham, he also had some criticisms. He thought Bentham was kind of emotionally stunted, not very deep. He felt like Bentham relied too much on just his own way of thinking, like he couldn't grasp the full range of human experience.
And Mill added something to Bentham's theory, right? The test of quality.
Right. Bentham thought all pleasures were basically equal, but Mill argued that some are just better than others, regardless of how intense they are. He talked about higher pleasures like intellectual and artistic stuff, and lower pleasures like just physical sensations.
So he was trying to avoid the whole philosophy for pigs criticism.
Exactly. He was saying, look, a human wouldn't choose to be a pig. Even if this pig was super happy wallowing in mud, there's something more to us than just seeking pleasure.
But Wickle points out a problem with Mill's attempt to make utilitarianism more sophisticated.
He does. Mill was trying to make utilitarianism more than just about animalistic pleasures, right? But he also extended the whole idea of maximizing pleasure to all sentient beings.
So not just humans, but animals too.
Yep. And if morality is just about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain for everyone, then how do you even calculate that? I mean, how do you compare the happiness of a human to the happiness of an ant?
It gets complicated fast.
It does. And Wiker points out that the modern animal rights movement actually uses this idea from Mill to argue that animals have moral rights.
Interesting. So what does Wicker ultimately think about Mill's version of utilitarianism?
Well, he argues that Mill, because he was an atheist, didn't really understand how messed up humans can be. Like, he was too optimistic to see that utilitarianism could lead to a society obsessed with intense pleasures, even if they're harmful, and where people are super sensitive to any kind of pain, even minor discomfort.
So like a society of addicts and wimps, basically.
Kind of, yeah. And Wicker also thinks Mill couldn't imagine that some people would want more than just earthly pleasures. Like, that some people might actually find this whole utilitarian pursuit kind of empty and meaningless.
Okay, let's move on to Charles Darwin and his book, The Descent of Man. Now, Wicker sees a big, potentially dangerous implication in Darwin's theory of evolution, even as it's presented in Origin of Species. What is it?
Well, he argues that if you accept Darwin's idea of natural selection, then it logically follows that humans should try to control who reproduces, like encourage the fit to have more kids and prevent the unfit from reproducing. And that, of course, is the basic idea behind eugenics.
Right, and there have been attempts to distance Darwin from the eugenics movement, especially after the horrors of Nazi Germany.
Exactly. But Wicker's point is that eugenics is a direct logical consequence of Darwin's theory.
Makes sense. And Darwin himself was a little hesitant to apply his ideas to humans in Origin of Species, wasn't he? Why do you think that was?
It was probably a strategic move. He knew that saying humans evolved from apes would cause a huge uproar, especially back then. The idea of evolution was already linked to radical groups, and Darwin wanted to be accepted by the mainstream scientific community, so he kind of tiptoed around the issue in Origin.
Smart move. But he does address human evolution in The Descent of Man, doesn't he? And there are some things he says that Wicker finds pretty disturbing, especially in light of the whole eugenics movement.
Yeah. Wicker highlights Darwin's concerns about how civilized societies try to protect the weak. Things like asylums, poor laws, medical advancements. Darwin worried that this was interfering with natural selection, actually harming the human race.
Interesting. It's like he's saying we're becoming too compassionate, too caring.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
He compares it to breeding domesticated animals. If you don't select for certain traits, you get weaker offspring. And he asks, why don't we do the same with humans? Why do we let the worst animals breed?
Wow, that's pretty harsh language.
It is. And he didn't just talk about it. He actively endorsed eugenics. He thought that when people get married, they should demand freedom from hereditary diseases, things like tuberculosis, epilepsy, even feeble-mindedness. He thought it was immoral to pass on these traits.
And he even brings up the Jukes family as an example.
Yeah, that was a famous case study back then. They were this family with a history of crime and poverty, and they were used to argue that certain traits are inherited. Darwin even talked about the parasitism of these families on society. They take resources, but they don't contribute anything.
And what was his solution to all this?
He actually suggested separating the sexes in asylums and preventing people from degenerate races from getting married. He was serious about this stuff.
So in a way, he's taking this idea of survival of the fittest and applying it to human society.
Exactly. But there's another side to Darwin, too. He also tried to explain how moral qualities, like courage and sympathy, evolved.
Okay, how did he explain that? I mean, those don't seem like traits that would necessarily give you a survival advantage, right?
Well, he thought they evolved because they helped groups survive. Like, if a tribe has people who are brave and care for each other, they're more likely to win wars and outcompete other tribes.
That makes sense.
But Wiker sees some problems with this idea of sympathy as a product of evolution. First, he says, if sympathy is just a biological adaptation, it can easily become this mushy niceness without any real moral principles behind it.
So, like, being nice just for the sake of being nice.
Right. And it can also blur the lines between humans and animals, which maybe leads to stuff like the animal rights movement, something Darwin probably didn't intend.
Secondly.
Well, for Darwin, sympathy is just one possible outcome of natural selection. So is race. He actually saw human races as different subspecies and even predicted that the civilized races would wipe out the savage races through competition. It's like he's just observing, not making a moral judgment, but it's still pretty chilling.
Okay, now let's get into the wild world of Friedrich Nietzsche. Specifically, his book, Beyond Good and Evil. Now, how did Nietzsche view utilitarianism? We just talked about Mill, so I'm curious what he thought.
Well, he basically thought it was a recipe for mediocrity. He saw Mill's greatest happiness for the greatest number idea as prioritizing the lowest, most basic pleasures over those that are more uniquely human.
And how does that tie into his Darwinian perspective?
Well, for Nietzsche, just like for Darwin, genuine progress requires struggle, even suffering. If you're just focused on maximizing comfort and pleasure for everyone, you end up with stagnation, regression, like you're going backward on the evolutionary ladder.
Interesting. So comfort and ease are the enemies of progress.
Absolutely. And there's another key aspect to Nietzsche, one that Wiker says is super important for understanding him. It's his deep aristocratic contempt for mediocrity. And Wiker acknowledges that this is a tough one for us to grasp today,
Yeah, we're all about equality these days.
Right, but for Nietzsche, the average, the common, the mediocre, these were things to be despised. He was all about celebrating the exceptional, the extraordinary.
Okay, so how did this disdain for the average play out in his philosophy?
Well, he looked at utilitarians, those focused on the general welfare, as herd animals, just following the crowd. He believed there's a natural hierarchy among people, and what's good for the masses isn't necessarily good for the exceptional individual. He even talked about a hierarchy of moralities.
So different rules for different people, essentially.
You got it. And Wiker connects us back to Darwin, too. Remember how Darwin talked about how tribes with courageous and loyal members were more successful in war?
Yeah.
Well, Nietzsche saw a parallel there. He believed in a natural aristocracy, where the better people should rule over and use the lesser ones. He thought this is a fundamental law of nature, that the strong should dominate the weak.
He didn't shy away from these ideas, did he? I mean, that's pretty strong stuff.
Nope, not at all. And he wasn't a fan of traditional morality either. He famously distinguished between master morality and slave morality, right?
Right. Master morality is all about strength, power, self-affirmation. Good is whatever is strong and life-enhancing. Bad is whatever is weak and contemptible. And slave morality, that's the morality of the oppressed. It values things like pity, humility, patience, basically strategies for surviving suffering. Good is whatever alleviates suffering, and evil is whatever reminds them of their oppressors.
Exactly. And you can probably guess where Nietzsche placed Christianity in all this.
I'm guessing he wasn't a big fan.
Not even close. He saw Christianity as the ultimate expression of slave morality. He thought it had made humans weak and pathetic by elevating the values of the weak and trashing the virtues of the strong.
So Christianity was basically holding humanity back, in his view.
Yeah, he thought it had turned humans into these dwarf animals, obsessed with equality and comfort instead of striving for greatness. His solution was to get back to a more natural aristocracy, to embrace the values of the strong and leave behind the whole good versus evil thing.